This is a special Humans Invent Cycling podcast recorded this week live in front of an audience at Cadence Performance in South London. In this episode we'll discuss the week in professional cycling, and in a second podcast out early next week we'll have a Q&A with the audience. This is our sort of first effort at a live Humans Invent Cycling podcast stroke cycling anthology event. Just to introduce ourselves more fully, I'm Richard Moore, Daniel Freeb here on my right.
Hello, Richard.
Lionel Burney here.
Hello, Richard.
And Ellis Bacon.
Hello, Richard.
Lionel and Ellis are the co-editors of the cycling anthology, and between us we've all covered numerous Tours de France and other races. But since we're doing the podcast here, we should start by asking Lionel where we are.
Well, Richard, we're in the Cadence Cycling Centre in Crystal Palace, South London. I'm coming out in a sweat, having come south of the river for the evening, but it's a fantastic venue. Daniel and I were here just before Christmas with Sean Kelly doing an event talking about his autobiography, and I recognise a couple of faces, people who came here that evening. And after that, Frank invited us to come back and just talk generally about cycling. So here we are.
Here we are, and there are about 70 of you here, so thank you very much for coming out. It's a great audience, just about full. So let's kick off with talking about reflecting on the weekend's racing, the first cobbled classics of the year, and a victory for Ian Stannard on Saturday in Het Nieuwsblad. Not the first time that Team Sky have won that race, in fact. Juan Antonio Flecha won it in 2010, their first year, but they have struggled to conquer the cobbles, as it were, and to win these big one-day races. Lionel, does his victory mean that Sky have cracked it?
No. We were having this debate a bit earlier about what constitutes a true classic, and although obviously you're not going to turn down winning Het Nieuwsblad, it's still only one of the semi-classics, really. It's not quite up there with the top races like the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix. That extra 60 kilometres is what really makes those races. So it's a big step up for particularly Ian Stannard to actually break into being able to win a race of that stature. The next logical step for him is obviously the Tour of Flanders or Paris-Roubaix. But I think what was most impressive was that they did have a battle plan, they put it into action, and they pulled it off with two men on the podium.
They almost didn't. I didn't think they were going to pull it off, though, because the group behind looked, there were three riders behind, and they looked as if they would catch up with them, and Edvald Boasson-Hagen was there sitting on, perfectly placed, had it come back together, and I thought he was a better bet in a sprint than Ian Stannard proved to be.
And even Greg Van Avermaet, really, I thought he's a pretty good sprinter. I thought might well have had the kick over Stannard there at the end, but I think Van Avermaet said he was just frozen and cold and wet and feeling pretty miserable, really, and just couldn't react to Stannard. But I think Stannard showed, didn't he, that perhaps it is time for Sky to get everyone behind him, perhaps Boasson-Hagen, as they've done in the past, and have one or two big leaders rather than sending everyone there and sort of, well, not hoping for the best, but almost, really.
I think the thing with Saturday's race was that they knew that Stannard on his own would be vulnerable. Whoever he's with in a small group finish, he's going to have to do that. Not even a sprint, really, is it? It's a kind of a cross between a sprint and an attack, where he goes from a long way out very hard and tries to basically ride everybody off the wheel, because he's not explosive, he's just incredibly powerful. And I think having Boasson-Hagen there as the more kind of natural sprinter, it meant that they had those two cards to play. So had Stannard been pulled back by Van Avermaet, then they would have had Boasson-Hagen to kick for the victory. So they played their cards very well, I thought.
We should mention Luke Rowe as well, young Welshman who was 11th on the day in what was a very tough race. And I think Van Avermaet, his condition, his state at the end, did tell us just what a tough day it had been. And Ian Stannard certainly does thrive in those conditions. Daniel, did you see much of Het Nieuwsblad?
I was going to introduce a topic there that we talked about in the pub beforehand. And Lionel suggested that Edvald Boasson-Hagen was a choker, and Greg Van Avermaet was a choker. So we can stir the pot straight away, which I thought was a little bit harsh. I mean, Greg Van Avermaet admittedly has finished second, third, fourth numerous times in big races, but I was just keen to get your views on the record about that.
Well, obviously, and king of the chokers, perhaps.
With all of BMC listening.
Well, yeah, and Van Avermaet's been in good positions before, hasn't he? And not quite. I mean, I know he had a good result at Paris Tours, didn't he? But between the three of them, it did come down to the numbers, didn't it? And Stannard, as I've just said, He's not going to beat even Van Avermaet in a straight up sprint. So they had to play the cards that they had, and I think Sky have been accused often of trying to dictate races in sort of numerical sense. By we talked before about the Tour of Flanders. The first year they did it in 2010, where they bossed all of the race that didn't matter, and then when the actual race kicked off, they were nowhere to be seen. And so they got their two best men into the perfect position and had options. So perfect way to win a bike race like that.
But are Sky going to choke when the real important racing begins in 3 or 4 weeks?
I don't know necessarily about choke, but in the Tour of Flanders or Paris-Roubaix, perhaps the weather won't be as bad, but it could be. But the thing is, at that point that Stannard crossed the line, that's when it really starts in the Tour of Flanders. So that's the point where the Cancellara's, Boonens and the real top riders that have come alive.
I thought it was interesting how underwhelmed Stannard himself seemed in victory. There was quite an ecstatic reaction to his win, his biggest one-day victory in one of those races by a British rider in quite some time. But he didn't. Maybe it was just again the cold. He was miserable with the cold, but it didn't seem that he was ecstatic, and perhaps he has his eyes on a bigger prize. Let's talk as well about Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, which was the next day, won by Tom Boonen, who we do expect. He was riding on Saturday as well, but out of it. But he won a very good race, a very tactical race on Sunday.
I thought it was a better race, really. I mean, yes, we had Stannard win in Het Nieuwsblad, but probably more people saw Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, because I think, was it the only one that was on Eurosport, I think? So, but yeah, fantastic race. And I mean, to see, 5 Omega Pharma riders there at the end, and 3, I think it was, Belkin riders. I mean, I thought that was terrific to watch the finish.
Of the two races, it is kind of the less heralded, simply because I think the Het Nieuwsblad, previously Het Volk, is the older and the more established of the two, and I think at some point they were moved together, so they went one followed the other on consecutive days. But if you've ever been over to Belgium, I think I was trying to count up how many times I've been to Het Nieuwsblad or Het Volk over the years. Probably I think 9 or 10 times. Obviously missed the first British win. That's typically stayed at home this weekend, but. When I first was getting into how the rhythm of the races and how they all worked, we used to go over, watch Het Volk on the Saturday, and go home on the Sunday morning, not actually stay and watch the Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, which, when you become more familiar with the terrain that these races are taking place in, you realise that it goes over a lot of the same roads. It goes over the Older Qualermont again, goes through a lot of the same towns, and so there's a real kind of feeling that Belgium is en fête for the weekend. And certainly, it's a shame. I think that the Het Nieuwsblad wasn't on the TV, but if you watched the Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, which I think they showed on the big screen here on Sunday, it gives you a real sense of what those races are all about. Miserable weather, riders ducking and diving, jumping up onto the cycle path, the cobbles and the cold.
I mean, Lionel, would you agree that if an adjective existed, Belgium-y, there's nothing more Belgium-y than Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, particularly the start. It's just... it's just on a random street. The buses just park up in front of these terraced houses, and it's really in the middle of nowhere, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Kuurne is like a little sort of, not a hamlet quite, but a village which is sort of part of Kortrijk. And they're really looked down upon by the people of Kortrijk, which is a lot smarter. It's a much smarter town, and there's a really nice cobbled square in Kortrijk. But Kuurne is like you say, Daniel, it's kind of basically a main road, and they start the race there, they send them off to Brussels, and then 5 hours later they come back. But other things that are very Belgium-y are cigarette smoke, beer and chocolate. So that's it.
As you've said, very accessible from here as well, of course, isn't it? And Kortrijk, there's a cyclocross race. Is it January, I think, maybe? But yeah, I mean, also, great races to get to. A nice sort of introduction to the classics, I think, really, if you've never been. And
it was a very Belgium-y lead group. Just watching that group, just huge riders.
Lots of grunting, wasn't there?
Lots of grunting. Johan van Summeren looked sort of normal size in that group, and he's about 8'4", I think. But it was an amazing sort of collection of, and the Omega Pharma riders in particular were huge engines, and Boonen looks certainly to be back to his best. And I suppose if we're looking ahead to the other classics, first to Milan-San Remo, the 3 sort of big beasts are Boonen, Cancellara and Peter Sagan. Peter Sagan missed the weekend's races. We will talk about Mont Saint Rome in a minute, and that also means talking about Mark Cavendish, who's confirmed this week that he will. They've taken, it's not as hilly as they thought it was going to be, and it maybe suits him. So we'll talk about him in a minute. But you were just back from spending a couple of days with Peter Sagan, I think, Daniel.
Yeah. It wasn't just me, and it wasn't a romantic weekend, but I was at Liquigas. Cannondale this year they've got a new trainer, Sebastian Weber, who used to work for HTC. Used to be Mark Cavendish clashed with him quite a lot when he joined
It's
that
not like
team.
Mark Cavendish, is it?
Because Sebastian is very, very German, very scientific.
Germany.
Yeah, he's very German. And he has joined Cannondale this year, and one of the things he's trying to implement is a lot of small camps throughout the year, a bit like Sky have done. About 15 of the team were there. I mean, the feeling is in that team that this is Sagan's year for another big step forward, and he sort of lopes around the place like a kind of sedated attack dog. He looks ready to wake up at any moment and just start eating people. But he's quite an impressive sort of physical specimen without starting to mop my brow. He's certainly a very imposing physically, and he's one of those guys who really doesn't divide any opinion in the team. You speak to every single rider, and every single rider is just absolutely blown away by what he can do on a bike, and just sort of how robust he is physically. The amount he eats, the way he can recover. He just seems to have a kind of extra sort of 10%. I'm not talking about hematocrit, nothing to do with that. That in terms of just physical robustness, powers of recovery, and just power itself. And I just think that this is really his year, and he'll probably win one, possibly two of the big three monuments this spring.
I think, although he's not won one of those races, he was second in Tour of Flanders last year, he's not won one of those races yet, but I think we can say that he's not a choker. That's not the reason he's not won. And if he finds himself in a position to win, he will win. And he could win all three of these upcoming classics.
I mean, he's got a big problem, and the big problem is that no one wants to take him to a sprint. No one wants him in the group to sprint against him. And if he attacks on a climb, then no one works with him. And Milan San Remo would have been, with the new climb, the Pompeiano, that was going to be, and that would have been the sort of classic catch-22 that Sagan finds himself in more and more. That there would have been breaks go away, their attacks go away. Sagan probably would have been in them, but then no one would work with him. And I think the blueprint for Cannondale is the stage of the Tour de France, which finished at Albi last year.
Yeah.
And I think that is basically... I mean, there are times when Sagan can just win anyway. There were 3 or 4 races last year where you thought he's going to wait for the sprint, and no, he just went off 5 kilometres from the end and rode to the finish. But I think increasingly they're going to find themselves having to do that, like they did in that stage, blow some of the fatties out the back, the sprinters, and have Sagan sprinting against everyone else, and usually he will win in that situation.
I was just going to pick up on Sagan, because we obviously, from the point of view of covering the sport, we know what he's capable of and just how good he is. But I spent a couple of hours with Mark Cavendish a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the mechanics of sprinting mostly. And I was running through the kind of the pecking order of sprinters at the moment, and obviously it's Cavendish, Kittel, Greipel are the big three. And then I was struggling to name a fourth. And Cavendish kind of leant across the table and said, "Don't say Sagan. Don't you say Sagan. He's not a sprinter." And he then said, he's basically Eddie Merckx. He can do absolutely anything. And that kind of, to hear Cavendish say, compare him to basically the greatest rider, the most dominant rider of all time, gives you a sense of how he's rated in the peloton at the moment.
Yeah, there is a feeling in the team, and speaking to coaches, that he has slowed down slightly in terms of his sprinting speed, but I think that's something that generally happens to sprinters throughout their career, because they train them over the course of several seasons. They're becoming more and more endurance athletes and they do lose speed. So I think that's happened to Sagan to a certain extent. But I mean, I don't
think it's going to matter as much to him as it would to a pure sprinter. Clearly,
no,
it's not that finishing speed that he really relies on.
No.
Entirely.
And in terms of the comparison with Merckx, I mean, a lot of people have made that comparison. It doesn't really hold up yet. But the guys at Cannondale are kind of just, they're curious to see. I mean, he might not be there next year, but they're curious to see how that they fully expect him to just make a major breakthrough this year. And for them, the interesting thing then is going to be what happens. Does he retain that hunger? Because that's really when the dangerous phase of especially anyone who starts winning young. I mean, I think it's happened to Cavendish to a certain extent. They kind of have to reinvent themselves after they've won everything, and they've got nowhere else to go. Often there's a dip for 2 or 3 years, and then they reinvent themselves, remotivate themselves, relaunch themselves. And whether that Merckx Sagan comparison holds up will depend on how much he rests on his laurels, because certainly at the moment he's really, really hungry still.
And you mentioned earlier when we were chatting how sort of in the moment he is. He's one of these, as you say, the attack dog. He's somebody who just seems to find himself in races and do what, it's instinctive, isn't it? It's not part of a plan. He's sort of the antithesis of Bradley Wiggins, I suppose, in a lot of ways. But speaking about his team, as you mentioned, that is a team built almost entirely around him. There are some other, Viviani's still there, isn't he?
Yeah.
Moreno Moser, the young rider as well. But it is basically a team built around Sagan. And speaking of Cavendish, it does occur to me that Cavendish would be better off in a team like that than the team that he's in, which has all these. There they were at the weekend. Boonen is back to his best. They've got a couple of options for the Tour. Young Kwiatkowski looks very, very good. Rigoberto Urán is there. And don't you think that Mark Cavendish is the sort of guy like Sagan who can handle that responsibility of being the leader who everybody in the team is there for?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that would be the position that he would be in, but I don't think there were that many options open to Mark when he left Sky, and I think ultimately that's what might end up happening. He might end up in a team. His next team might be a team. He might have, through 2 perhaps not difficult experiences in this case with Omega Pharma, but I think there are elements of it that he hasn't been too enamoured with, and I think that maybe next time he will realise that he does have to be in a team which is entirely devoted to him. But just on Sagan, I mean, in terms of how kind of lucid he is and how also his decision making sort of off the bike and how clearly he sees his career and his future, he's already quite adamant about that he needs a team. He wants a team built around him. And there's a lot of speculation about him maybe going to Alonso's team next year. I understand Tinkoff is maybe the favourite at the moment. But I think Cannondale, if you stayed at Cannondale, whether that will merge
Sagan you're talking about.
Yeah, Sagan. Yeah. Whether that merges with the Alonso team, I don't know. But I think that is still a good option for him, Cannondale.
Before we move on to our next topic, which Daniel's really kind of looking forward to, can we run through our tips for Milan-San Remo? Can Cavendish win Milan-San Remo? And if not Cavendish, then who, Ellis?
Yeah, I'd favour Cavendish. I think, as we said before, he wasn't sure if he was going to do it. Unclear what kind of form he's in. I mean, he has been winning in the Middle East. Ruta del Sol he won, didn't he?
He won.
Yeah.
Algarve,
sorry, yeah.
Algarve,
I think so. He's obviously decided to go. The climb, the Pompeiano, isn't there, so he must be going thinking he can win.
No, I don't think he can, because he made a comment about how in order to be good in the spring he would have to sacrifice a little bit in his preparation for the Tour, and this year everything was about the Tour, and it's too late at this stage to adjust. He can't suddenly have ridden an extra however many 100,000 kilometres, not 100,000 kilometres, an extra few thousand kilometres of training and racing. Everything's been structured a certain way towards July. I think he'll go there because the climb's been taken out, and there is still a chance if it's a kind of controlled race, but I don't think it will be. So I think Sagan will win.
Maybe if there's snow. Okay, I'll tip Andre Greipel. I think he's my man for Milan-San Remo. Daniel?
I'm not sure if they're going to win, but I think Lampre are going to have a phenomenal team. They're going to have Rui Costa. They're going to have Sasha Modelo, who's a real dark horse. I'll forget someone else. They're Diego Ulisi, but they've also got Filippo Pozzato, who will probably stuff it up for them because that's what usually happens. I spoke recently to his best friend. I mean, imagine this is his best friend saying this. Luca Paolini was asking him about Pozzato, what's gone wrong with his career, and he just shook his head. He just said he's a magician at messing things up. So I think it will probably contrived.
Well, it'd be nice to see him have a little go, wouldn't it, off maybe down the descent of the Poggio.
Yeah, and he also doesn't get on with Modular, apparently, so there's another.
Brilliant.
We should probably mention Degenkolb as well, shouldn't we?
Degenkolb.
That Marcel Kittle's not going to be there, apparently, perhaps weirdly, but...
Yeah, difficult to see a scenario where Degenkolb would in a small group that doesn't have Greipel or probably even Sagan in it, I guess.
The Humans Invent Cycling podcast. Interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
Let's move on to the next topic, the World Track Cycling Championships, which have just finished. We're just going to do a brief sort of post-mortem, I suppose, on those. Disappointing from a British point of view. The women did very well, the men did very badly, and there's been a lot of speculation over whether the fact that Dave Brailsford wasn't there, he wasn't there last year either, but he's certainly been drifting away from the track team and all the programmes at British Cycling, apart from Team Sky, obviously, over the last couple of years. I've got not a theory, but I felt that in the run up to London, the London Olympic Games, that they were going to certainly struggle to match the performances in Beijing. I felt they were on the way down, and I think the way they performed, they did match the performance in Beijing. I think probably because they were home Olympic Games, and it sort of squeezed the last few drops out of the lemon, as it were. And I think that they really missed their kind of totemic figures, the Hoy, Pendleton, there's Bradley Wiggins obviously isn't around, Geraint Thomas, those kind of people. So I think they've got a really hard sort of challenge ahead of them to become the dominant force around. It brings on all kinds of questions about UK sport funding and all the rest of it, and whether if that drops off, because it's very much according to potential medals at Worlds and Olympics, then have we seen the best of the British track team?
Well, I think everyone's focused on the men's side because it's the first World Championship since 1998 when the men didn't win a medal of some colour. But the women did fantastically. I mean, Jo Rousel, only, I think, the fourth woman to win the World Pursuit Championship after Beryl Burton, Yvonne McGregor and Rebecca Romero. I mean, that is an achievement that even sort of 10, 12 years ago would have put her up there as one of the highest achievers in the sport. And Jess Varnish knocking out Becky James in the sprint showed that she's stepping on and improving. I think on the men's side, the difficulty is that there's this huge road cycling sport which has basically drained the talent away. Somebody like Simon Yates won the points race last year in Belarus, not there this year because he's racing for Orica Greenedge. So the men's squad is almost, certainly on the endurance side, is almost a kind of development squad. And these guys are young. They haven't really been exposed to this level of competition, consistently over a number of years. So there's still, it's not all doom and gloom.
No, I'd agree entirely. I mean, try telling Jo Rousel that, Britain had a bad track championships. It seems unfair as well to me to lump everyone in together to say the British team. You've got the men and the women, and then beyond that as well, you've got the sprint side and the endurance side, which are completely different, completely different disciplines with completely different coaches. So for whatever reason, the men haven't fired this time. But as you said, Richard, I mean, before the last Olympics, they've been sort of a bit quieter really, and then someone like Jason Kenny came good. And I know you were maybe in that press conference where Gregory Bourget kind of turned interviewer, didn't he, and sort of said, well, where have you been for the last 3 years? And
he may well be asking that again in Rio, because Jason Kenny is, as we spoke about in the podcast last week, the great enigma. I think it does highlight one of the challenges of being a track racer, just the lack of racing. Daniel, did you watch much of the Track World Championship?
No, Rich, no. But I do agree with everything that Ellis said.
It was on very late at night. It was way past Daniel's bedtime.
But you're not a massive fan, I think it's fair to say, are you?
No, not really, Rich. No.
We had a bit of a debate before we came on tonight about whether we should talk about it. How many of you watched the World Track Championships? Show of hands, please. Quite a lot. How many are interested in them? Yeah.
Well,
See,
you're right.
Justified. Thank you. Anything else to add? I was surprised yesterday at Shane Sutton's comments. Now, Shane does have a tendency to talk. And he's not always that good at editing himself. And I guess when things are going well, as they generally have over the years, that's not been such an issue. But when things don't go so well, as they didn't, really, from the men's point of view, I should add, he's very honest, and that's not always perhaps the best policy. In particular, with the quote that I'm talking about, is he said that the men have got to take a look at themselves, and he said of the team pursuiters in particular, I think, to be honest, I just don't think they're talented enough. They don't have the talent, which it's a very dismissive thing to say, especially for young guys who are starting off their career, to be told they don't have the talent. Now, Mark Cavendish famously was once told that he didn't have the talent, and he reacted pretty well to that. But it's a high-risk strategy, if it's a strategy or if it's just... Can you give us a blast of Shane?
No, I like Bosenhagen. I'm a choker under pressure. Shane would say, mate, that's off the record, mate. Put it in paper.
Yeah, but he says that after he said it. And you're supposed to say that before you say it. That's the problem.
Yeah, he does. I mean,
that's how you got caught earlier with the Bosenhagen.
Well, indeed. He's... but, I mean, Shane does wear his heart on his sleeve, doesn't he? But, he's also a man who does deal in black and whites, really. You either win or you don't. And he doesn't try and dress things up. So if he feels that they've underperformed, then they'll go back to the drawing board and work on it. I mean,
sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, if Brailsford does step down, could you see Sutton taking over? I mean, he's sort of the right hand man at the moment. Really,
Chris Boardman who said that there needs clarity, there needs to be somebody in charge, and there hasn't been. And I heard grumbles to this effect before London as well. In the couple of years leading up to London, there was definitely a feeling. Victoria Pendleton wrote about in her book as well that there was nobody in charge, and they were running on empty at times. And they've got a very good coaching team, but you need somebody in charge. And Chris Boardman, after the World Championships there, said Brailsford needs to make clear what he's going to do. And he said that he didn't think Shane Sutton was the guy to be overall in charge.
He mentioned, I think he did anyway. I don't know if anyone heard it. I don't know if I dreamt it because it wasn't very late. But I think Boardman at one point even mentioned, it was a bit fanciful maybe, but Chris Hoy even.
Well, I wondered about that. I don't think he's got the time or the willingness to. As he has often said, coaches work harder and travel more than riders, and he doesn't really want to be making that commitment. He's got his bike business, he's got various other commitments that he's involved in now. I think Paul Manning possibly has been a coach there for a few years now, and he's very much. I remember there was a quote. I can't remember. Did Brailsford say it? But the first day Paul Manning walked into the velodrome as a coach, somebody said, "There's your successor," and Paul Manning is very much a kind of prototype Brailsford coach, and I think he possibly could be the guy, maybe.
It's very difficult though, isn't it? I mean, who wants to be David Moyes to Sir Alex Ferguson?
You're listening to the Humans Invent Cycling Podcast, powered by Sharp.
Well, we move on. I can sense Daniel dropping off beside me here. We don't want to lose him completely. In this final little part, as mentioned at the start, this is a cycling anthology event as well, and there is a forthcoming anthology. When is it published?
Early June.
A few of us have contributed to that. We were going to just talk briefly about what we've done, because we've I don't know what the editors are doing, but we've done our work. Did mine quite a while ago, actually. What are you doing? What's the hold up? What's the hold up?
Really, isn't it? To get the other copy in and then decide what we're doing later.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Daniel, what have you contributed?
Well, my choice was really dictated by Lionel, who was very draconian about it had to have an English link, a British link. So
you've done something in Dublin.
I've mixed the most tenuous thing possible.
I should say it's loosely a kind of Brits at the Giro and the Tour de France. Apart from Richard's piece. No, it's got a link. It's got a
back in their face.
Anyway, so I did. I feel I kind of regretted this because there was so much about Pantani's. There was so much about Pantani, the 10th anniversary of Pantani's death when the anniversary actually came on the 14th of February. But I'd chosen to write about Pantani because obviously the tour started in Dublin when he won it in 1998, but also while I was doing the feature, I came across a little anecdote which allowed me to hang it on something else. So I've basically said it. The 1998 tour was won by an Englishman, and you'll have to read the anthology to see why. But what I've written is really about the 1998 tour, and really untold story. And I suppose that Tour de France was unique and important also in that it was the last Tour de France where there was kind of wholesale suspicion about what everyone was seeing. Okay, the Festina scandal was going on, but you were still getting articles in that Tour de France, people saying that Pantani had saved it. Pantani was the clean white knight that had rescued the Tour de France. So it was important historically from that point of view, but also as a kind of snapshot of Pantani, I thought it was very interesting that he didn't want to do the Tour de France. He just won the Giro, and Pantani was very casual and about training, and he was very kind of almost mystical. And I think he sometimes cultivated this image that in the month between the Giro and the Tour, he wouldn't tell anyone what his plans were, and he'd kind of summoned all his teammates to his home, and they'd be on training rides, and he'd just sort of at random points on the ride, he'd just say, what do you reckon then about the Tour? And then he'd stop talking about it again. So he kept them all guessing for a long time. Then he finally turned up, and then the first week he was kind of getting up in the morning and asking his roommate, what kind of stage is it today? Where are we in France? That kind of thing. So he was and then as the race went on, he kind of got more and more serious about it. And I also talk about the doping, which we found out more about the doping because of the Senate inquiry in France last year, which basically told us that conclusively that Pantani had doped, and not only that he doped, but whereabouts in the race he had doped. A lot of guys I think threw away their drugs in the 1998 Tour as soon as the police arrived, but what the Senate inquiry told us was actually quite a lot of them kept their drugs and carried on doping all the way. That's my story.
Well, I've also written about a mercurial doping climber.
What's the British link in your story?
There's no British link. I got
written by a British writer.
Careful. I did actually get a quote from David Miller for it.
Exactly, he was his team.
So my chapter in the anthology was inspired by a line in Tyler Hamilton's book, The Secret Race, where he said that Iban Mayo, this Basque climber who 2003, 2004 emerged as a real rival to Lance Armstrong and still holds a record for the climb of Mont Ventoux from the 2004 Dauphiné. There was a line in this book that said that he was now a long-distance lorry driver, and he disappeared in 2007. He tested positive at the Tour for EPO. He was on the way down anyway. He'd won a stage of the Giro that year, but not in the manner that he'd won races in 2003, 2004 when he was an incredible climber, won at Alpe d'Huez in 2003 in the Tour as well. And that line really struck me, that Iban Mayo had become a long-distance lorry driver, and I was determined to find out, A, if it was true, and B, what the link with Pantani is there. There was this sense that he was a similar, he seemed to have his demons in the same way that Pantani did. He was inconsistent. He'd be one of these guys who'd ride at the back and switch off and then switch on again. And there was a famous stage in 2004, the Tour, I think the stage of Plateau de Bay, where he just collapsed on the bike. He tried to climb off his bike at one point and was forced to get back on. And to those of us watching, it did look like a mental collapse. And so you thought, this guy has got, potentially got psychological problems or something. So I started making some inquiries. Did anybody know what happened to Iban Mayo? And nobody did, and partly I think that's because the Basque region is such an insular region. So even other Spanish journalists just had no idea what happened to him. Eventually, a Basque journalist said that he was still in touch with him occasionally. So he said, I'll ask him if he'll give you an interview. He didn't really know what happened to him, but a couple of months later I got an email from him. He said he was happy to do an interview, which was a great surprise. So I went over to Bilbao in December and went for a very memorable lunch with Iban Mayo, who is not a long-distance lorry driver. In fact, has never driven a lorry. He runs an electrical installation company in the Basque Country and is doing very, very well and looked incredibly healthy. And we went for a 4-hour lunch with a lot of alcohol as well. And there was a Basque drink that we had at the end of it, which was rocket fuel, and I don't remember much else after that. But he was very charismatic and not at all what I expected. I'd been told that he was very shy and he'd be very guarded and cagey, and he wasn't at all. He was quite open and funny, and he seemed to me like somebody who had successfully made the transition from pro cyclist to normal person. And there were times when he said that he couldn't believe, looking back, that he'd actually been a cyclist. He almost couldn't believe that he'd had that different life, and it was interesting. So that's my chapter in the anthology. It was quite a memorable lunch.
Very, very good it is too, and you detail the lunch as well, which I enjoyed.
There
I
were about 6 courses.
Yeah. I had sort of had lunch with a rider for my chapter. I went and spent a couple of hours talking to Mark Cavendish about the mechanics of sprinting, which perhaps is underselling it slightly. It doesn't sound as gripping as it is, honestly. I had a sort of an epiphany really when Cavendish was sort of winning all of these stages, and it seemed to, they seemed to be almost identical stage wins. Certainly 2008 when he won 4, and 2009 when he won 6, and you kind of almost took them for granted, and we became used to Cavendish winning. And during the time when I was working for a Sunday newspaper, I'd look at the road book and kind of half dread a Saturday which had a sprint stage, because it would mean having to go into the firing line of Mark Cavendish after he's either won or lost, which is when you see him at his best or at his worst. And I wanted to know where that mental explosion comes from, and why it happens after the finish line and not before, because in the sort of 10 kilometres leading up to the line, there's this kind of almost shutdown that he seems to go into, where it looks like he's on autopilot. And so I wanted him to talk through exactly what's going through his mind in those sprint stages. Some of his revelations were really interesting, talking about the mental stresses, the strain of being a sprinter in a race as demanding as the Tour de France. And he said that Sky's performance coach, Tim Kerrison, said to him, where during the 2012 tour, when Wiggins was winning and Cavendish was trying to win stages and trying to win the green jersey, Kerrison said to him, I can understand Bradley Wiggins winning the Tour de France more easily than I can understand you finishing the Tour de France, because physically he doesn't test like the sort of person that should be able to endure all the mountains and then produce those explosive finishes.
He's defied people. That's been the trademark of his career, I guess. Ellis, what have you written for the anthology?
Well, I haven't quite finished it yet, I have to admit. I'm lagging behind a little bit. I've been writing another book. So I should say I'm going to be writing about cycling and music. So I'm looking at, there's a band called Abdu Japarov that some people might have heard of. A guy called Fruit Bat, who used to be in a band called Carter USM. That's his band.
Unstoppable Sex Machine.
And indeed, yep. And then the Delgados as well, Scottish band.
I know the Delgados very well.
Do you?
In fact, Alan Woodward from the Delgados follows me on Twitter.
Oh, there you go. Name drop. So about bands named after cyclists, and then about cycling songs as well. Songs famously, of course, by Queen and Pink Floyd and Mark Ronson, bringing it a bit more up to date. You look surprised. Do you not know that one?
What's that song?
It's called the Bike Song or something. It's good. So so it's a bit kind of
Kraftwerk there.
I didn't know Kraftwerk. I should put in as well, shouldn't I? You're writing it for me. But it's just going to be quite light-hearted, and I suppose often that so far I think it should change for the next volume. But Lionel and I have often kind of written at the end and sort of I guess I've a few times done something a little different. Last time I did a choose your own adventure.
Delgado's, the original name was Bernard Eno.
Is that
you can
right?
have that.
I didn't know that. Well,
but everyone will know it.
Well, yeah, you've ruined it.
The Cycling Podcast at humansevents.com. Innovation, craftsmanship and design.